Thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next story. A 16-year-old black girl stood quietly in court, accused of vandalizing city property. But what she painted wasn't random. It was a message the judge didn't want to hear. When he silenced her, she responded with words pulled straight from the Constitution. Can a teenager with no lawyer, no support, and nothing but her father's old law books really shift the weight of justice? What would you have done in her place? I'd love to hear your thoughts as the story unfolds. Now, let me take you back to that courtroom. It was just past 9 on a Tuesday morning when the courtroom doors creaked open. The air inside was thick, stale with heat and heavy with judgment. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched beneath the high ceilings, packed with quiet strangers and murmuring spectators. You could hear the low buzz of conversations, the shuffle of legal papers, the occasional cough echoing like a gavel. Even the walls, pale and indifferent, seemed to lean in, waiting. Then she entered. Maya Bennett, just 16, walked in alone. No lawyer, no parent, just a slim girl with tightly braided hair, school shoes too clean for a courtroom floor, and eyes that scanned the room like she was searching for a single safe place to land. There wasn't one. Every head turned. Some frowned, some scoffed. A few whispered. "That's the one who defaced city property," someone muttered. "She's the graffiti kid." No remorse. She kept walking, chin slightly lifted, but her fingers trembled at her side. Her seat at the defendant's table felt miles away. At the far end of the room, presiding over it all, sat Judge Thomas Crawford. A man of stature, silver-haired, expression carved from stone, known in the county for being efficient, unbending, and unimpressed. His eyes narrowed as he glanced over his reading glasses, down at the girl now seated before him. One brief look, then back to his papers, as if Maya was already judged. And maybe she was. Maya sat silently, folding her hands tightly in her lap, her shoulders square, but you could tell she felt the weight of the walls, of the stairs, of something no teenager should ever have to carry alone. Outside the courthouse, the sun blazed like any ordinary day. But inside, for Maya, it had already begun to storm. A moment later, the prosecutor stood, tall, crisp suit, confident voice. The kind of man who never second-guessed a word once spoken. He didn't even look at Maya. "Your Honor," he began, "the facts of this case are simple. The defendant," he motioned in Maya's direction with a stiff hand, "willfully defaced public property in a blatant act of civil disobedience." He paced slowly, deliberately, each step echoing off the courtroom floor like a verdict of its own. "She spray-painted a wall of City Hall," he said, not with meaningless scribbles, but with a full-scale mural, images of violence, and a phrase that questioned the integrity of our police force. There was a pause. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, voice sharp like broken glass. "She did this in broad daylight. Cameras caught her. There are no questions of guilt here. What we see is a troubling pattern. Young people, emboldened by social media, treating our institutions like canvases for their anger." He turned to Judge Crawford. "We're not here to debate her intentions. We're here to protect order, to remind this community that actions have consequences." Judge Crawford didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply removed his glasses, wiped them with a white cloth, and said coldly, "So she's a revolutionary now?" The courtroom chuckled, not loudly, but enough. Crawford continued, voice low and flat. "A child with a can of paint and an overinflated sense of righteousness." He looked directly at Maya for the first time, but not with curiosity, only calculation. "Miss Bennett, you're 16. What exactly do you believe you're fighting for?" Maya opened her mouth slightly, but said nothing. Crawford didn't wait for an answer. He leaned back in his chair. "We've created a generation that confuses rebellion with purpose, and now they bring that confusion into my courtroom." A silence fell, thick, weighted. Maya sat still, but her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something else, something beginning to burn. And in that moment, everyone saw her as one thing, a troublemaker, a headline, a girl too young to understand and too bold to behave. But no one, not even the judge, saw the truth yet, that this girl wasn't here to argue. She was here to make history. For a moment it was quiet. Then, softly but clearly, Maya stood. Her voice was steady, even if her knees weren't. "Your Honor, may I speak?" All eyes turned to her, some with surprise, others with annoyance. Judge Crawford didn't even look up. He was flipping through his notes, flipping as if nothing important had just been asked. Then, with the sharpness of a blade, he answered, "No." One word, just one. But it hit harder than a sentence ever could. Maya hesitated, but tried again, this time gentler. "I'd like to explain." Crawford finally looked up. His expression hadn't changed. "Explain?" he repeated, voice like dry wind. "This is not a classroom, Miss Bennett. This is a courtroom." Maya blinked, her lips parting, unsure whether to keep going. Crawford didn't give her the chance. He leaned forward slightly, voice calm but cutting. "Your role here is not to educate me, or this court. You're not here to deliver speeches. You're here because you broke the law." He paused, letting the silence build around his words. "This room is not a place for children to test their philosophies. It is where consequences are delivered. You will sit, and you will listen." A faint murmur rippled through the room, like a breeze brushing over dry leaves. Maya didn't argue. She sat, quietly, but her hands, resting on the table, curled into slow, trembling fists. She stared straight ahead, not at the judge, not at the prosecutor, just ahead, at nothing, at everything. And in that stillness you could feel it, the sting of being unheard, the ache of being silenced in front of people who never meant to listen in the first place. It wasn't just injustice. It was humiliation. But Maya didn't cry. She didn't protest. She folded her voice back into her chest like a secret. Because sometimes the smartest thing a girl can do is wait. Wait for the right moment, the right words, the right way to make them listen. And that moment was coming. The courtroom faded. The judge's voice, the whispers, even the cold, polished walls. For a moment, Maya wasn't there at all. She was 10 again, curled up on the old couch in their apartment on Pine Street. The one with the uneven leg and the blanket that smelled like laundry and lemon balm. Her father, Marcus Bennett, sat beside her, reading aloud like he always did, his voice slow, calm, like every word mattered. That night, he held a heavy hardcover book on his lap, pages yellowed and corners dog-eared. "This," he said, tapping the spine, "this is how change happens, baby. Not through yelling, through knowing what they don't expect you to know." Maya leaned against him, small and curious. "What is it?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "A collection of cases," he said. "Real people, real voices. They stood up even when no one wanted to listen, and because they knew the law, the system had to look them in the eye." She didn't understand much of it then, but she remembered the names. Brown v. Board, Loving v. Virginia, Tinker v. Des Moines. They sounded like spells. Powerful, mysterious, sacred. Her father had once been a history teacher, beloved by students. But one year during Black History Month, he'd gone off script, spoke about systemic injustice, police brutality, and the stories the textbooks left out. The school board didn't like it. They told him to stick to approved content. He refused. By summer, he was gone. Maya remembered the silence in their home after that. Not bitter, just hollow. But every night, he still read to her. He still believed in truth. And more than once, he'd look her in the eye and say, "Your mind is your shield, Maya. Your voice is your sword. Don't let anyone take either from you." On her 12th birthday, he gave her the book, the same one from their couch. Inside the cover, he had written, "For the day you need it, and you will." Years later, during protests downtown, Maya had watched footage of a black man being shoved to the pavement. Her father watched, arms folded, face unreadable. Then he turned to her and said quietly, "The law isn't broken, it's used by people who hope you never learn how to read it." She hadn't fully grasped those words back then. But now, sitting alone at a courtroom table, Maya did. Her father hadn't raised a troublemaker. He'd raised a witness, a student of silence, someone who saw injustice and refused to look away. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the folded edge of a photocopied page, the same case he once read to her out loud, Tinker v. Des Moines, the one about students. Speech. The right to express without fear. She didn't know if quoting it would change anything. But she knew this much. She hadn't come here to be quiet. Not today. Not after everything her father had lost. Just so she could learn how to speak. They kept her in the holding room during recess. 4 gray walls. 1 metal chair. A water fountain that sputtered more air than liquid. The silence pressed in, thick and unmoving, except for the soft shuffle of papers in Maya's hands. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the cold wall, a stack of photocopied legal documents spread out in front of her like puzzle pieces. The pages were wrinkled, some smudged with ink, others barely legible. But she had read them all. Again and again. Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, 1969. She knew the title by heart. And more importantly, she knew the principle. Students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. And if that right held true inside a school, it had to matter beyond it. Maya underlined the key passage one more time with a dull pencil, her hand steady now. She wasn't just memorizing it, she was preparing to live it. Because no lawyer had shown up. No adult had walked in to say, "You've got this." And she wasn't naive. She knew how this kind of courtroom treated girls like her. Quiet girls. Black girls. Girls without names that carried weight. But still. She believed in the words on those pages. She believed that the Constitution didn't come with an asterisk. She believed that her father hadn't handed her that book in vain. In that holding room, with nothing but a worn folder and her father's voice in her head, Maya made a choice. She would speak. Maybe not now. Maybe not in the exact way she hoped. But she would speak, and when she did, she would use the law they tried to weaponize against her. She pressed the pencil flat across her knee and whispered aloud, "They can ignore me, but they can't ignore the truth." It wasn't defiance. Not really. It was clarity. And when the guard finally opened the door and motioned her back toward the courtroom, Maya stood, not with fear, but with purpose. No one expected her to win. No one expected her to know. And that was exactly what she was counting on. Because the thing about truth is, it doesn't need volume to carry weight. It just needs a voice. And Maya Bennett had found hers. The courtroom reconvened just after 11 a.m. Same polished benches, same stiff faces, same low hum of murmurs from the back rows. But something had shifted. Maya could feel it in her spine. As she took her seat at the defendant's table, she didn't fidget, didn't lower her eyes. Her fingers stayed loosely folded, her breath even. Judge Crawford cleared his throat. "We'll resume," he said, adjusting his robe with one hand and signaling to the prosecutor with the other. But before the man could rise, Maya stood. Just like that. Quiet. Calm. Certain. A small gasp escaped someone near the back. The prosecutor looked mildly offended, as if a schedule had just been insulted. Judge Crawford narrowed his eyes. "Miss Bennett," he said, voice clipped, "you were not asked to speak." Maya didn't flinch. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied. "But if the court is going to decide my future, I believe I have the right to speak for myself." Another murmur, this one louder. Crawford looked like he might object, but paused. He studied her for a long second, as if weighing whether this interruption was worth his time, or his scorn. Then, with a dry breath, he waved his hand. 2 minutes, he said. No more. Maya nodded once, then stepped forward. She pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket, creased, worn, nearly translucent at the edges. "I'd like to refer this court," she began, her voice steady but low, "to the 1969 case of Tinker vs. Des Moines Independent Community School District." The entire room stilled. Even the court reporter looked up. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that students do not, and I quote, shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." She paused. "And if that right holds inside a school, then surely it does not vanish on the steps of City Hall." Crawford leaned forward slightly now, no longer disinterested, no longer aloof. Maya turned one page, revealing the highlighted paragraph. "The mural I painted was not vandalism. It was protest. It was protected speech, just as Mary Beth Tinker's black armband was. And if this court punishes me for it, it does more than silence a teenager. It rewrites precedent. Silence. Thick. Unblinking. Charged. No one laughed this time. No one whispered. Crawford blinked, just once. His mouth parted slightly, as if something should be said, but wasn't ready. Even the prosecutor had stopped shuffling his notes. It was Maya's courtroom now. For the first time since the trial began, no one saw her as a girl playing dress-up in the justice system. They saw her for what she was, a mind that refused to be underestimated, a voice that refused to stay silent. And in that moment, Maya didn't just defend herself. She reminded them all what justice was supposed to sound like. In the back row of the courtroom, behind a row of tired suits and folded arms, Elaine Harper sat completely still. Notebook in hand, pen resting against her lip. She had been assigned to cover the story like any other local court case. Minor, procedural, over by lunch. A teenage girl charged with vandalism? It was barely worth column space. But when Maya stood and spoke, something had shifted. Not just in the courtroom, but in Elaine. There was something in the cadence of the girl's voice. The quiet control. The way she said they can't ignore the truth. It wasn't just powerful, it was familiar. Too familiar. Elaine's heart slowed in her chest as memory crept up behind her. Uninvited, but insistent. Pine Street. 12 years ago. Elaine was a junior at the community college, back when she still thought truth alone could move mountains. She'd been in Marcus Bennett's American history class. Room 204, third floor, windows always stuck shut. Marcus didn't just teach about the Constitution. He made it breathe. He would say, the First Amendment isn't ink on paper. It's a mirror. Look in it, then decide who you are. Elaine had idolized him, and she remembered, vividly, the day he pulled her aside after class. She had just published a piece in the student paper about police overreach, and the administration didn't like it. Marcus had looked at her with calm eyes and said, if they're angry, that means you said something worth saying. Keep going. It was the first time anyone had ever told her that her voice mattered. She blinked now, back in the present, staring at Maya. Same cadence, same fire, same last name. Bennett. Her pen fell to the page. She hadn't seen Marcus in years, heard rumors he'd lost his job. Some said he moved out of state. Others whispered he was blacklisted. But here, right here, was his legacy. Alive, speaking, unshaken. Elaine didn't wait. She slipped out of the courtroom during the next recess, found the bench outside under the courthouse oak tree, and opened her laptop. Her hands moved fast, not just as a reporter, but as a witness who had once been taught to never be neutral when truth was on trial. The article she wrote was clear, focused, sharp as glass. 16-year-old stuns courtroom with Supreme Court argument in defense of free speech. She included Maya's quote, word for word. She told readers about the graffiti, what it said, what it meant, and she reminded them who Marcus Bennett was. She hit publish, and within an hour the story spread. Local news picked it up. Then regional blogs. Then a few national threads. People commented, shared, debated, defended, but more importantly, they listened. Back inside the courtroom, Elaine returned to her seat. Maya hadn't noticed her. She didn't need to. Elaine wasn't there to be seen. She was there to make sure Maya was. And as she watched the girl straighten her back, raise her chin, and hold her ground before a judge who finally looked like he was second-guessing himself, Elaine felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. Judge Thomas Crawford had presided over more than 2,000 cases in his career. He'd ruled on theft, fraud, violence, disputes that tore families apart. He prided himself on being steady, impartial, immune to noise. But now, sitting alone in his chambers during recess, a strange stillness hung in the air. The courtroom outside was buzzing. He knew that. A bailiff had slipped in earlier with a newspaper article pulled up on his phone, brows raised, voice low. Sir, this thing's blowing up. That girl, Maya Bennett, she's all over the internet. Crawford hadn't responded. He simply waved the man off and closed the door. But now, he was staring at a printout. One of the exhibits from the prosecution. The photo of the graffiti Maya had painted across the wall of City Hall. A face. The dark outline of a man, eyes wide, hands raised in surrender, and beneath it, the words, "Do I look threatening to you?" Crawford held the photo in both hands. Not like evidence, like something heavier. The phrase echoed in his mind. At first he dismissed it. Another teen making a statement without understanding context, just noise, emotion, impulse. But now it didn't feel like noise. It felt like something else, something sharp, familiar, uncomfortable. He remembered a case 5 years ago. A 17-year-old boy arrested for resisting arrest during a traffic stop. No body cam footage, conflicting testimonies, and yet, Crawford had ruled against the boy. Another case, a woman, single mother, accused of disturbing the peace at a school board meeting. Crawford hadn't listened to her full account. He remembered thinking she was too angry to be taken seriously. And then another, and another. He told himself he was being efficient. Firm? Neutral. But was he? Or had he simply learned to stop seeing people whose stories didn't fit the script? Crawford leaned back in his chair. He didn't like how this felt. The girl's voice, Maya's, lingered in the room like smoke. She hadn't been dramatic. She hadn't begged. She had spoken with clarity, with principle. She had spoken in the language he was supposed to understand best, the law. And he had almost shut her down without hearing a word. The headlines didn't bother him. The public pressure didn't scare him. He dealt with worse. What unsettled him was the growing crack in his own certainty. He thought of his father, a police officer from another time, a man who once told him, "You don't let emotion sway the bench. You rule from the head, never the heart." But what if? Sometimes justice required both. What if ignoring a voice, simply because it was small, was the very thing the law was meant to prevent? For the first time in years, Judge Crawford felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't shame. Not yet. But it was close. And it was growing louder. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that follows routine rulings or long recesses. This was different. It was the kind of silence that comes before something important. Judge Crawford entered from his chamber slower than usual, his face unreadable, his robe crisp, hands steady, but there was something in his eyes. Something. Softer. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and looked directly at Maya. "Miss Bennett," he began, his voice calm, measured, but with a slight tremble only those listening closely would catch. "I've taken the past hour to reflect, not on the noise outside this room or what's trending on a screen, but on what happened inside this courtroom, on what I chose not to hear, and what you chose to say anyway." A few heads turned, some furrowed brows. Maya remained still. Crawford continued, "I've been a judge for 23 years. I've delivered rulings I was proud of, and some I've quietly questioned." He paused, glanced at the photo of the graffiti, still lying beside the evidence file. "Do I look threatening to you?" He read it aloud this time, then looked back at Maya. "I dismissed you," he said, "not because your argument lacked merit, but because I assumed your age, your background, your voice couldn't possibly carry the weight of truth." The room was still as stone. "But truth," he added, "does not depend on who speaks it, and justice does not depend on how loud the crowd outside is. Today I am not changing my decision because of public pressure. I'm changing it because of something far more difficult to admit." He leaned forward, hands clasped. "Today it was not the media or the headlines that forced me to see my error. It was you. A 16-year-old girl who reminded this court of the law it's sworn to uphold. Miss Bennett, I owe you an apology." There was a quiet gasp from the gallery. Someone blinked away tears. Elaine, in the back row, lowered her pen. Crawford continued, his voice now full and unwavering. "This court rules in favor of the defendant. All charges against Maya Bennett are hereby dismissed." He tapped his gavel. But then he spoke again, this time not as a judge but as a man. "And it is the recommendation of this court that the mural in question remain untouched. Let it serve not as a mark of rebellion, but as a reminder that courage can come from the quietest voices, and that justice, real justice, sometimes needs to be challenged to be found." Maya didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded. Once, like someone who had always known the truth, and had finally seen the world catch up to it. The courtroom didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. Because something had shifted, permanently, not just in law books, but in hearts. The doors of the courthouse swung open slowly, and sunlight poured through the frame like a quiet celebration. Maya stepped out first. No handcuffs, no bowed head. Just steady feet and a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since morning. Reporters stood off to the side, cameras in hand, but none dared shout. The crowd was hushed, not in disinterest, but in reverence. For once they weren't looking at a defendant. They were looking at a voice that refused to be erased. And then, between the bodies and the stairs, she saw him. Marcus Bennett, standing still in a crisp gray sweater, a worn book tucked under his arm, and his eyes wet, proud, unshaken. He didn't say anything at first, just opened his arms. Maya walked straight into them. He held her tight, like someone trying to hold together everything the world had once tried to tear apart. Then, finally, he whispered, "You did it, baby. You finished what I couldn't. You made them stop. You made them listen." Maya didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Some truths live in silence. Across town, in the quiet of early morning, Judge Thomas Crawford took his usual walk to chambers. Same route, same black coffee in a paper cup, same polished shoes on pavement. But now, there was one thing different. Each morning, as he passed the southern wall of City Hall, he stopped, just for a moment, to look. The mural was still there, untouched. The eyes of the painted man still looked out, not with anger, but with quiet strength. And beneath them, the words, "Do I look threatening to you?" Crawford never spoke aloud when he stood there. He just paused, long enough to remember, not just Maya, but every voice he'd once dismissed too quickly, every story he hadn't stayed long enough to hear. Back in the present, people still debate what happened that day in court. Some call it a lucky break, others call it a clever defense. But for those who were there, for those who truly listened, it was something else entirely. A reminder that sometimes justice needs a voice brave enough to rise, and a heart brave enough to receive it. Because sometimes all it takes is one girl speaking the truth, and one man willing to hear it. Sometimes justice needs a voice brave enough to speak, and a heart humble enough to listen. And on that day, we found both. Sometimes the strongest voices don't come from behind podiums or microphones. They come from quiet corners of courtrooms. From young girls who dare to believe that truth still matters. This story wasn't just about the law. It was about courage, about the power of being heard, and about what happens when someone listens with more than just their ears. If this story moved you, even just a little, feel free to like the video, share it with someone who still believes in justice, and hit that subscribe button to stay connected with Mr. Max Stories. Your support truly means the world to us. It's what keeps our team inspired to bring you more powerful human-centered stories like this one. Thanks for being here. We don't just